The name was Joy Ruth Armstrong. The 21st of July, 1999. A bright 26-year-old nature educator named Joy Ruth Armstrong found herself entirely isolated in her woodland cabin for the very first time that season. Her home was a secluded employee dwelling dubbed the Greenhouse, just one of about 30 modest structures tucked away within the remote Foresta settlement of Yosemite National Park. With her housemates gone, the Florida native born the 20th of December, 1972, and a proud Dr. Phillips High School alum was left completely unsupervised in the wilderness. She possessed a profound devotion to the wild, forging a passionate path as an environmental scientist and wilderness teacher. Employed by the Yosemite Institute, she guided youth through nature-based learning initiatives for a charity directly affiliated with the National Park Service. Those who worked alongside her painted a picture of a vibrant soul, a woman whose boundless, infectious vitality lit up every room she entered. Just recently, she had conquered the towering peaks of Mount Shasta and boldly challenged the sheer granite face of El Capitan. Yet, before the sun rose again, she would vanish into the shadows. Earlier that fateful afternoon, a 37-year-old maintenance worker from the neighboring Cedar Lodge Motel was prowling the winding roads of the Foresta district. The drifter, Carrie Anthony Stainer, fixed his cold gaze upon the solitary woman as she casually drifted between her doorway and the surrounding woods. Concealed on his person was a dark kit of horrors, a loaded firearm, heavy adhesive tape, and a blade. Creeping onto her deck under the guise of a routine burglary, he leveled the weapon and aggressively corralled his victim back indoors. After restraining her and hauling her into his vehicle, he quickly learned his captive was not about to surrender without a fierce struggle. In a frantic bid for survival, she hurled herself headlong out of the rolling pickup truck's window and sprinted frantically toward freedom. The attacker quickly intercepted her, wrestling her deep into the thicket, where she fiercely buried her chin into her collarbone to fend off his slashing weapon. Ultimately, his brute strength prevailed. By dawn, authorities would stumble upon her lifeless form, resting beside a quiet creek. The alarm was initially raised by an anxious acquaintance in Sausalito, who contacted law enforcement after the young woman failed to show up for a scheduled gathering. It was the 22nd of July when wilderness patrols formally located her grim resting place along a waterway in the Foresta vicinity. Crucial tips from locals placed a striking blue, 1972 International Scout, the suspect's distinct ride, idling menacingly near her quarters on that tragic afternoon. Federal investigators brought him in for an interrogation but inexplicably let him walk a deeply controversial move. Following a minor separate detention and subsequent discharge, the suspect bolted from the region entirely. Seeking refuge at a nudist retreat near Sacramento known as Laguna del Sol, his cover was blown when a sharp-eyed patron linked his identity to urgent media broadcasts. Federal authorities descended on the resort, placing him in cuffs on the 24th of July, a mere 72 hours after his victim took her final breath. The chilling sequence of events that unfolded next would leave seasoned detectives absolutely paralyzed with shock. While transporting the suspect back to Sacramento, Federal Agent Jeff Rinnick masterfully cultivated a deceptive camaraderie, prompting the prisoner to freely open up about his dark secrets. After detailing his most recent atrocity, he dropped a bombshell that floored the agents. He was also responsible for the unsolved disappearances of 3 sightseers at his workplace earlier that year. For 6 agonizing hours, the man sat in the vehicle, coolly mapping out the gruesome specifics of all 4 fatalities. He coldly admitted to harboring violent urges toward women for 3 decades. Just what kind of monster had been masquerading as a humble groundskeeper in America's most picturesque sanctuary? More terrifyingly, how did this predator manage to slip through the cracks for so many years? Given the federal jurisdiction of the crime scene, he entered a guilty plea in September 2000, accepting responsibility for calculated first-degree offenses and fatal kidnapping. By the 30th of November, 2000, a judge handed down a definitive ruling, permanent incarceration, stripping him of any hope for future freedom. Standing before the court, he shed bitter tears, expressing a hollow desire to rewind time and undo the carnage he had unleashed. Yet, this tragic loss was merely the closing act of a much broader, darker saga. Detectives were blissfully unaware that a mere 5 months prior, this exact same wilderness had served as the backdrop for a significantly more profound nightmare at his hands. His origins trace back to the 13th of August, 1961, in the sun-baked town of Merced, California. He was raised in a household where a dark cloud of profound misfortune had long since settled. In 1972, his 7-year-old sibling Stephen became the victim of an infamous abduction, enduring 7 agonizing years of captivity before finally breaking free. The miraculous return captivated the entire nation, leaving the older brother to quietly simmer in the shadows, entirely eclipsed by the massive media frenzy surrounding his sibling. In his twisted recollection of his youth, every ounce of parental warmth, focus, and pity was exclusively reserved for the returned captive. Medical records show a troubling obsessive diagnosis as early as age 3, compounded by dark allegations of unspeakable abuse at the hands of a relative during his formative years. Even with a lifetime of glaring psychological warning signs, he miraculously managed to evade the justice system entirely until 1999. Today, he sits locked away deep within the California penal system, bearing a separate, ultimate penalty for the trio of tourist fatalities. However, since the state paused all ultimate sentences in 2006, followed by an official executive halt in 2019, his final date with justice remains indefinitely suspended. Joy Ruth Armstrong battled her tormentor with breathtaking courage, refusing to surrender until her final breath. Still, the trio of earlier horrors uncovered during that chilling car ride would expose an abyss of depravity far deeper than anyone could have ever imagined. Long before the killer's identity was finally unmasked, an unimaginable atrocity had already shattered the tranquil illusion of Yosemite. These were the infamous Yosemite slayings. Valentine's Day, 1999. A trio of sightseers arrived at the Cedar Lodge in El Portal, merely a stone's throw from the iconic national park gates. Carol Sund, aged 42, thrived as a real estate agent in Eureka and hailed from the deeply respected Carrington dynasty of Sonoma County. A devoted wife to her husband, Jens, she was universally beloved throughout her hometown for her boundless empathy and kind spirit. Joining her was her 15-year-old daughter, Juliana, affectionately called Julie, a vibrant cheerleader fresh off a major tournament at the University of the Pacific. Rounding out the tight-knit group was 16-year-old Silvina Peloso. An exchange student hailing from Cordoba, Argentina, Silvina's mother shared a lifelong bond with Carol, forged decades prior when Carol studied abroad in South America. This getaway was intended to be an unforgettable, once-in-a-lifetime adventure. The trio had recently wrapped up joyous excursions through Disneyland and the bustling streets of San Francisco. The following day, February 15th, they spent hours trekking through the majestic wilderness before retreating to their motel quarters at dusk. They were entirely unaware of the predator lurking nearby. The lodge's resident maintenance worker, Carrie Stainer, had spotted the vulnerable women through an unclosed blind. Observing a solitary mother and 2 young girls without any male protection, he knocked on their door under the guise of repairing a phantom plumbing issue. Once inside, he produced a firearm, binding the terrified victims with heavy adhesive. He choked the life from Carol, then brutally violated and silenced young Silvina. Julie was kept captive in torment for several agonizing hours, ultimately being transported to an isolated vista overlooking the Don Pedro Reservoir. At that lonely precipice, just as dawn broke on February 16th, he ended the teenager's life, later concealing the other 2 bodies within the boot of their own hired vehicle. Navigating the car deep into the desolate stretches off Highway 108 near Long Barn, he abandoned the evidence, creeping back 48 hours later to incinerate the scene. In a calculated bid to derail the impending manhunt, he purposefully discarded Carol's purse along a random sidewalk in Modesto. Panic set in when the group mysteriously vanished, entirely missing their scheduled rendezvous with Jens at the San Francisco terminal that Tuesday. The Federal Bureau unleashed a massive task force of 60 operatives, yet for more than 4 grueling weeks the search yielded nothing but dead ends. The first grim break came on March 18th, when a solitary trekker stumbled upon the scorched remains of the Pontiac within the dense Stanislaus National Forest. 24 hours later, authorities extracted 2 badly immolated bodies from the vehicle's rear compartment, positively identifying them as the missing mother and the Argentine exchange student. A macabre twist surfaced on March 25th when a sinister parcel reached the Modesto Bureau. Inside lay a crude sketch and a taunting note reading, "We had fun with this one." Following the killer's twisted cartography to the rugged terrain surrounding Don Pedro Reservoir, law enforcement finally uncovered Julie's resting place. The burning question remained: who authored that grotesque correspondence, possessing such intimate knowledge of the crime? Here, federal agents would commit a devastating blunder. Detectives zeroed in on a local syndicate of narcotics addicts from the Central Valley, specifically homing in on suspects Michael Larwick and Eugene Dykes. By early summer of 1999, authorities confidently declared to the press that the perpetrators were securely behind bars. It was an assertion that would soon unravel in the most disastrous way imaginable. The actual murderer, Cary Stayner, had been casually questioned alongside the rest of the motel staff, yet he slipped completely beneath the investigative radar. Lacking any prior convictions, he maintained an absolutely chilling composure while face-to-face with federal agents. He simply went back to his maintenance duties at the exact property where the nightmare began. As the government pursued innocent suspects, a monster roamed unchecked for weeks. Emboldened, he struck again that July, claiming the life of Joy Ruth Armstrong. One haunting question lingers. Could her death have been prevented if authorities had scrutinized the lodge's inner circle? Formally indicted in the autumn of 1999 on a trio of lethal charges and assorted felonies, the killer attempted to shield himself with an insanity defense. Due to massive media coverage, judicial proceedings were relocated to a courtroom in Santa Clara County. By late summer of 2002, it required a mere 5 hours for a stunned jury to convict him across the board. 2 months later, following a brief 6-hour review, that same panel concluded he deserved the ultimate irreversible punishment. Finally, in December 2002, the presiding magistrate delivered a crushing legal blow, a triple capital sentence stacked atop 45 additional years of confinement. To this day, the disgraced handyman languishes within the unforgiving walls of the California correctional system. Whispers persist tying him to at least 5 lingering cold cases scattered throughout the foothills, though formal indictments for those phantom crimes have never materialized. Amidst the sweeping overhauls dismantling San Quentin's execution wing in 2023, he was likely relocated to a different heavily fortified compound. For the surviving relatives of the victims, the psychological scars of that winter have never truly faded. One must wonder, how countless were the tourists who brushed shoulders with this apex predator during his quiet tenure at the inn? How many unsuspecting families shared his breathing space in the cafeteria or passed him in shadowy corridors, entirely oblivious to the darkness hiding behind a handyman's smile? These atrocities permanently stained one of the nation's most treasured sanctuaries. Our investigation now pivots to a far more obscure stretch of wilderness in Arkansas. Here, a gruesome discovery amongst the timber birthed a baffling enigma that remains unsolved to this day. This is the haunting story of Paige Autumn White, which began on a cold Saturday, March 27, 2021. Deep within the shadowed timber flanking Black Snake Road, authorities made a grim discovery: the lifeless remains of a 32-year-old woman. This wasn't some remote wilderness, but Hot Springs National Park in Arkansas, right by the Whittington Avenue Gateway, a federally protected forest cutting straight through an urban center. Detectives instantly launched a full-scale criminal probe, barricading a significant stretch of that winding asphalt by the very next morning. By Sunday evening, a spokesperson for the National Park Service formally acknowledged that an active high-stakes inquiry was underway. Yet, in a chillingly protracted silence, 17 agonizing days would pass before the world finally learned her identity. What caused this deafening pause? More unsettlingly, what dark secrets were forensics unearthing among the pines that they refused to disclose? The victim, they ultimately revealed, was Paige Autumn White. A local of the Hot Springs and Mountain Pine communities in Garland County, Arkansas, she was the beloved daughter of Jeff and Cheryl White. Published in the local Sentinel Record on April 22nd, her obituary tragically noted that she had gained her angel wings back on March 27th. Mourners gathered to honor her memory on April 25th during a solemn celebration of life at Forest Creek Barn in Royal, Arkansas. Physically distinct, Paige was missing her right eye and bore the tattoo of an anchor etched into her right foot. It wasn't until April 13th, 2021, that authorities finally stepped before the press to confirm who she was. For almost 3 grueling weeks, a lifeless body rested in a federal morgue while her own community remained utterly oblivious to her tragedy. Given the federal jurisdiction of the crime scene, the National Park Service's investigative branch and the Federal Bureau of Investigation out of Little Rock spearheaded the hunt. They drew heavy tactical support from Hot Springs Police, Arkansas State Troopers, and the Garland County Sheriff's Department. This massive multi-agency coalition underscored the bureaucratic nightmare of federal terrain crimes, where local cops are stripped of total autonomy. The medical examiner's verdict was unequivocally cold-blooded: homicide. Yet, the exact mechanics of her demise remain sealed away from public ears, a profoundly irregular suppression of evidence. Typically, detectives leak at least a vague cause of passing to trigger memories and solicit vital leads from the populace. Instead, federal profilers drafted a meticulously chilling psychological blueprint of the phantom who committed the act. The assessment theorized a perpetrator intimately acquainted with both the vanished victim's final footsteps and her clandestine resting place. More disturbingly, they suspect this killer hides in plain sight, living or working locally. Agents desperately pleaded for clues regarding Paige's final interactions before the darkness took her. Hot Springs National Park defies the conventional image of vast, isolated American reserves. It is entirely engulfed by the city's borders, seamlessly woven into a grid of suburban homes, historic hotels, and bustling storefronts. Black Snake Road isn't some rugged, unforgiving wilderness path conquered strictly by seasoned outdoorsmen. It acts as a mundane daily thoroughfare for townies, carving through protected woodlands just a stone's throw from front porches. The shadow who discarded Paige there possessed an intrinsic, almost terrifying mastery of that specific geography. They knew exactly which bends of asphalt fall dead silent. They calculated the precise hours of that silence, manipulating the shadows to vanish without a trace. Federal behavioral analysis corroborated this grim theory. This wasn't a drifting transient, but a deeply rooted fixture of the community. By January 2022, federal prosecutors delivered a crushing update: zero investigative momentum. Shortly after, the Arkansas Justice Project officially condemned it to cold case status. In the paranoid aftermath of the discovery, the internet erupted with viral hysteria regarding an active serial stalker hunting the city streets. This digital panic was heavily amplified by a lingering trail of equally unresolved tragedies haunting the wider Garland County expanse. However, intensive fact-checking investigations by both Snopes and PolitiFact entirely dismantled those terrifying urban legends. Park authorities stood firm, publicly declaring an absolute lack of evidence connecting this tragedy to anything beyond an isolated nightmare. The official investigation portal was quietly relegated to the digital archives during a January 2025 site overhaul, accompanied by an agonizing lack of fresh leads. To this day, no shadowy figures have been named, and the click of handcuffs remains unheard. The federal tip line lies eternally vigilant. Investigators cling to the unshakable conviction that a local resident holds the missing puzzle piece required to shatter the silence. What macabre events actually unfolded for Paige Autumn White along that winding stretch of Black Snake Road? And does the monster profiled by the Bureau still blend seamlessly into neighborhood life, quietly harboring a devastating, unspeakable secret? Paige's grim fate endures as a maddening void, entirely devoid of publicly named perpetrators. However, our next descent into darkness profiles a scenario where detectives harbored zero doubts about the architect of the tragedy. Nailing him to the wall, however, demanded the systematic dismantling of a decades-long labyrinth of deception. The victim, Tony Henthorne. On September 29, 2012, a husband and wife drove into the majestic Rocky Mountain National Park, purportedly celebrating 12 years of matrimony. The husband, Harold Henthorne, orchestrated an itinerary he cheerfully pitched as a romantic surprise wilderness excursion. Instead of the heavily trafficked paths of Bear Lake, he steered their journey toward the isolating, rugged terrain of Deer Mountain. Chilling snapshots captured that afternoon depict Harold perched precariously on a precipice, casting a deceptive smile toward his spouse. Detectives ultimately concluded this was a calculated trap, coaxing her to the fatal drop by feigning absolute security. Around 3:30 that afternoon, Dr. Tony Henthorne plummeted between 128 and 160 feet, meeting a brutal end. Dr. Tony Jill Bertolet Henthorne had just reached half a century of life. A Jackson native, she earned highest honors from the University of Mississippi Medical Center before forging a stellar career as an elite cataract and laser eye surgeon. The Colorado Avalanche hockey franchise trusted her as their official eye specialist, and by 2006, she ranked among the nation's premier medical professionals. A faith-based online matchmaking service introduced her to Harold, culminating in a wedding ceremony on the 30th of September, 2000. Welcoming their daughter Haley in 2005, Tony stood out as a remarkably gifted and successful individual. The mystery of that treacherous ledge quickly deepened when Harold's emergency dispatch recording triggered intense police suspicion. His demeanor was unnervingly collected, effortlessly rattling off precise satellite coordinates alongside recommendations for an airlift landing zone. Furthermore, Physical evidence completely contradicted his assertions of frantically administering artificial respiration to his dying partner. Her makeup remained flawlessly untouched, and a total absence of chest trauma disproved any life-saving chest compressions. Supposedly ending the call to save his phone charge, he then inexplicably initiated roughly 24 voice calls and fired off nearly 100 digital texts. He coldly notified her sibling of the tragedy via a brief digital message shortly before a wave of cryptic mail began surfacing. Law enforcement intercepted 17 unsigned notes, all pointing toward the darkly questionable demise of his previous spouse, Sandra Lynn Rischel. Back on the 7th of May, 1995, she was lethally crushed when an automobile supposedly tumbled from its lifting device. The fatal incident ostensibly occurred as she searched for a lost wheel fastener along an isolated mountain roadway. That convenient tragedy ultimately lined his pockets with an estimated $500,000 in death benefits. Closed as a tragic mishap within a mere 6 days, detectives abruptly tore the cold case open following Tony's demise, officially altering Lynn's conclusion to highly suspicious. A distinct shoe impression lingering on the car's exterior strongly hinted that the heavy machine was intentionally kicked from its supports. In a morbidly calculated pattern, he reduced both spouses to ash, dispersing their remains across the exact same wilderness expanse nearly 2 decades apart. Police searching his vehicle uncovered a highlighted topological guide bearing a chillingly precise crossmark directly over the fatal drop zone. Digital records proved he meticulously stalked the nature reserve no fewer than 9 times prior to the lethal excursion. Financial forensics exposed an astonishing $4.5 million in secret death benefits, contracts her relatives swore she remained entirely blind to. The ultimate psychological twist emerged from his finances. The man possessed absolutely no legitimate employment or corporate footprint since 1992. Despite masquerading as a nonprofit consultant, reality caught up on November 6, 2014, ending in a federal premeditated indictment. During his September 2015 court proceedings, the state meticulously laid out the sinister cartography, the massive payouts, the obsessive reconnaissance, and haunting proof of a supposedly accidental timber collapse that nearly crushed her back in 2011. His legal representation offered absolute silence, calling 0 individuals to the stand. Following 10.5 hours behind closed doors on September 21, 2015, the panel found him guilty. By December 8th, he was condemned to rot behind bars forever. Every single legal avenue for his release officially hit a dead end by September 2023. Now raised by her uncle, a 19-year-old Haley finally broke her silence in February 2025, coldly declaring she stripped him of the title of parent. A master manipulator, he orchestrated a flawless tragedy down to a single ink stroke on parchment. Yet the darkness of the wilderness hides deeper secrets like a 28-year-old enigma surrounding 2 adventurers, unraveled only by genetic wizardry in 2024. The tragic saga of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans. As June 1, 1996 dawned, authorities scoured the dense canopy of Shenandoah National Park for the vanished pair. Panic ignited when Julie's desperate father officially flagged her failure to return home. Tracking footprints toward a secluded clearing off Bridle Trail, mere fractions of a mile from Skyland Resort, searchers stumbled upon a nightmare that would scar the region for decades. The lifeless shell of Lolly Winans lay concealed within the canvas walls. Almost 40 feet away, Julie Williams was discovered discarded in a sleeping roll, both victims stripped of their clothing. Restrained by adhesive tape, violently silenced, and bearing savage neck lacerations, the grim scene was finally proven to be a brutal violation by modern forensics in 2024. The only surviving witness was their golden retriever, Taj, wandering aimlessly in the brush. It was a theater of pure cruelty, plunging their loved ones into a 30-year abyss before the monster was finally unmasked. At just 24 years old, Julianne Marie Williams hailed from the quiet streets of St. Cloud, Minnesota. A brilliant mind, she had claimed highest honors at Carleton College, leaving with a profound understanding of geology. Her life was a canvas of ambition. She conversed effortlessly in Spanish, crossed the Atlantic to investigate ancient mass extinctions, and devoted her time to humanitarian efforts deep in Central America. A veteran of remote archaeological excavations, she was destined to begin a fresh chapter at Lake Champlain on the 1st of June, a bitterly ironic date, as it became the precise moment her lifeless remains were discovered. Her companion, 26-year-old Laura Salisbury Winans, affectionately called Lolly by those who knew her, hailed from the quiet suburbs of Grosse Pointe, Michigan. She was forging her own path at Unity College up in Maine, immersing herself in the demanding field of wilderness leadership. Having clawed her way back from deep personal trauma, she dedicated her hours to a Waterville crisis sanctuary, dreaming of building a therapeutic nature retreat to heal fellow survivors. Their paths ultimately collided during 1994 within the walls of Woods Women Incorporated, located in Minneapolis. The agency pioneered extreme travel solely for female explorers. Amidst that empowering environment, a profound romance bloomed, binding them together for the better part of 2 years. On the 19th of May, 1996, the couple vanished into the sprawling wilderness of Shenandoah, accompanied only by their golden retriever, Taj. The final confirmed sighting of the pair breathing mountain air occurred just 5 days later, on the 24th of May. The investigation took a dark turn in July of 1997 when authorities intercepted Daryl David Rice, a man caught trying to snatch a vulnerable Canadian cyclist right within the park boundaries. A chilling inventory of his vehicle yielded sinister restraints, ultimately earning him an 11-year stint behind bars. By April of 2001, the narrative intensified when former Attorney General John Ashcroft formally pinned the tragic demise of Williams and Winans on Rice. The accusations carried a historic and devastating weight. 4 capital charges pursued under the banner of a federal hate crime, marking an unprecedented legal milestone. Yet the biological evidence whispered a different truth. Genetic material recovered from the cruel bindings and gags excluded Rice entirely, forcing prosecutors to abandon the charges in February of 2004. In a bizarre stroke of cruel irony, a mere 15 days after his name was officially cleared in the court of public opinion on the 20th of June 2024, Rice met a violent end, fatally struck down by a passing vehicle while pedaling his bicycle along a lonely stretch of Missouri tarmac. The shadows finally began to lift in 2021. A freshly appointed tactical unit from the FBI shifted their entire focus toward the silent physical traces left behind. The financial backing to re-examine these cold remnants was funneled directly through a specialized Department of Justice initiative designed to process neglected assault kits. Decaying artifacts gathered from that gruesome May 1996 forest floor were quietly handed over to an elite independent forensic facility. Against all odds, scientists managed to pull a pristine, workable genetic signature from the decay, which was immediately fed into the National Law Enforcement Database. The digital dragnet locked onto a ghost from the past, Walter Leo Jackson Sr., an established and dangerous predator stalking the streets of Cleveland, Ohio. The mathematical probability of this biological link was absolutely paralyzing, a flawless correlation, standing at 1 in 2.6 trillion. Brought into the world on the 2nd of November, 1947, Jackson masqueraded as an ordinary house painter, using his passion for deep woods trekking as the perfect cover to haunt Shenandoah's trails. Beneath the surface lay a terrifying multi-decade dossier of brutality that bled across state lines, earning him no fewer than 4 distinct tours in the penitentiary. Almost immediately after leaving that blood-stained forest, the predator slinked back to Ohio, where he wasted no time claiming new victims. But the law would never have the satisfaction of putting him on trial. Jackson drew his final breath behind bars in Cuyahoga County back in March of 2018, dying quietly at the age of 70. It wasn't until the 20th of June, 2024, that federal agents stood before the public and officially crowned him the monster behind the bloodshed. Despite the initial theories, investigators uncovered absolutely nothing to suggest the carnage was fueled by the romantic bond shared between the two victims. Today, an intense federal probe remains active, desperately trying to map out what other cold cases Jackson might have orchestrated during his unmonitored years roaming free. After 28 agonizing years, the grieving families were finally handed a name, only to discover the phantom they sought had already escaped to the grave. While that excruciating wait for genetic resolution spanned 28 years, the twisted narrative of our next mystery stretches even further into the dark. The key to unlocking this puzzle didn't emerge from a standard registry, but from meticulously tracing the ancestry of a dismembered arm, stumbled upon by innocent youth belonging to the enigmatic Summit Meadow Jane Doe. The macabre discovery unfolded on the 28th of June, 1983, as kids innocently explored the grassy expanses of Summit Meadow, just off Yosemite's Glacier Point Road. Their innocent games were shattered when they unearthed the severed human extremity. Tarnished silver bands clung tightly to the lifeless fingers of both hands. Park Service detectives examined the decay, deducing the fragments had likely been rotting there since 1982, tracing back to a woman of exceptionally slight build. Half a decade of silence passed until May of 1988, when a group of trekkers stumbled upon a bleached human skull resting ominously close to that original site. It took until 2009 for molecular science to catch up, finally proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the skull and the severed limb were fragments of the very same shattered life. The burning question lingered: whose face once belonged to that skull? For almost 4 complete decades, she existed solely as a nameless phantom. Then, during the restless spring months of 1984, the infamous Texas predator, Henry Lee Lucas, casually admitted to luring an unidentified hitchhiker near the park's boundaries before violently choking the life out of her. He chillingly pinpointed the exact stretches of Glacier Point Road and Badger Pass, confidently guiding investigators directly into the heart of the grim topography. Detectives on the ground were rattled, publicly declaring the drifter possessed highly classified details regarding the corpse that had never been leaked to the press. It was the kind of granular, horrifying knowledge exclusive to the butcher themselves. Even the discarded Budweiser cans littering the brush mirrored his signature beverage of choice. Yet, this supposed breakthrough carried a fatal flaw. The notorious drifter had a pathological habit of claiming responsibility for up to 3,000 separate murders, often under highly questionable interrogation tactics. Ultimately, he walked back the vast majority of his admissions, amid dark allegations that a Texas law enforcement task force had essentially spoon-fed him the horrific details. Death found him behind bars on March 13, 2001, allowing him to slip away before ever facing a courtroom for this specific nightmare. Even with the murky cloud of his endless retractions, seasoned Park Service detectives, both past and present, have stood their ground. They remain steadfast in their conviction that Lucas was the monster who orchestrated this grim affair. By 2017, elite federal agents pulled the file from the archives, armed with a renewed perspective and cutting-edge forensic tools. As autumn fell in 2020, investigators forged a critical alliance with Parabon Nano Labs and experts at Marshall University. Their weapon of choice was advanced whole genome sequencing combined with cutting-edge snapshot genetic phenotyping. What the biological data unmasked would completely fracture the established narrative of the manhunt. The slain woman possessed exclusively European ancestry, boasting naturally blonde locks and striking blue eyes. She was not of Hispanic origin, as authorities had theorized for almost 40 years, a massive revelation proving that every prior hypothesis regarding her identity was a dead end. Parabon's lead genetic genealogist leveraged forensic DNA tracing through the massive GED match database. By constructing intricate ancestral trees from biological hits, she meticulously navigated backward through time to isolate the victim's true name. On the 4th of January, 2021, a definitive genetic report finally assigned a name to the remains: Patricia Marie Hicks Dahlstrom. A subsequent biological comparison with a surviving family member cemented this chilling reality by April of 2021. The world learned her name during the second season broadcast of an investigative documentary series, which debuted on October 26, 2022. Brought into the world on June 1, 1954, in Washington state, Patricia carried deep psychological scars following the tragic loss of her brother in 1971. After a short-lived marriage that lasted from 1973 until 1974, she sought a fresh start down in Merced, California. It was there she tumbled into the deceptive embrace of the Sananda Apostolic Church, a dangerous fringe cult commanded by Donald Gene Gibson. Parading himself as a living deity, he orchestrated sinister rituals cloaked entirely in warped spiritual manipulation. His predatory methods involved targeting physically alluring disciples only to systematically drain and control their earthly wealth. The law finally closed in during December of 1980, sweeping up several indoctrinated followers, Hicks among them, in a sudden raid. By September of 1981, the false prophet faced a judge for abhorrent crimes against youth, ultimately earning 4 damning convictions. Yet, he vanished into the wind while out on bond, a phantom fugitive who has eluded the grasp of justice ever since. With her tormentor suddenly gone, Patricia finally found the resolve to break her chains to the sect. Sometime around 1982, she supposedly boarded a motorcoach bound for the vast, isolating wilderness of Yosemite. A solitary photograph mailed from a coastal shore, that September marked the absolute final whisper her family ever received. Detectives naturally probed a dark connection to notorious Yosemite serial predator Cary Stayner, a Merced local who had ominously lurked at the cult leader's 1981 trial. A chilling theory emerged. Stainer might have hunted her down as violent retribution for her courtroom testimony, given the twisted social overlap of their families. Despite the sinister coincidences, the lead federal investigator firmly refused to brand Stainer an official suspect without concrete forensic proof. Today, the file sits ice cold. 3 distinct, terrifying figures have occupied the crosshairs: Lucas, Gibson, and Stainer. Discarded beer cans recovered from the grim scene were still quietly undergoing advanced laboratory analysis as recently as 2022. The ghost of the meadow has ultimately reclaimed her stolen identity. Yet, the phantom who mercilessly snuffed out her life among the wildflowers has never faced a reckoning. She lingered as a Jane Doe for 4 agonizing decades. Meanwhile, another tragedy was unfolding, destined to become an infamous obsession in American true crime. The sheer notoriety of this subsequent mystery did not stem from its geographical setting, but rather from the powerful, shadowed figures tangled within it. Enter Chandra Levy. On the first day of May 2001, a vibrant 24-year-old woman named Chandra Ann Levy settled in front of her computer inside her secure Washington District of Columbia residence. Her digital footprint unveiled a chilling clue. At 11:34 that morning, she hunted for a specific map of Rock Creek Park. She then vanished off the face of the earth. When frantic parents called authorities on May 6th, investigators discovered her living quarters perfectly pristine. Crucial lifelines, her financial cards, cellular device, and identification were abandoned. The only ghosts missing were a set of keys and a single ring. A sinister sequence of events had unfolded in the shadowy void between that final keystroke and the deafening silence left in her wake. Born on April 14, 1977, in Cleveland, Ohio, her formative years were spent under the California sun in Modesto. Armed with a journalism degree from a San Francisco university, she was vigorously pursuing a master's program at the University of Southern California. In the autumn of the year 2000, ambition pulled her to the nation's capital for a prestigious public affairs role inside the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Her ultimate, tragically unfulfilled dream was to become a sworn agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Chandra Levy was a radiant, fiercely driven young woman laying the groundwork for a promising career within the federal government, yet she harbored a dark, closely guarded secret. She had become deeply entangled with 53-year-old Gary Condit, a married 5-term conservative Democratic congressman representing California. Keeping the illicit romance completely hidden from public view, she whispered the truth solely to her aunt, cryptically calling the politician her man. Federal Bureau of Investigation forensic analysis ultimately verified that Condit's genetic material was an exact match to biological evidence recovered inside her residence. Overnight, the mysterious disappearance erupted into a frenzied, nationwide media spectacle that consumed the country. Throughout the sweltering summer of 2001, an astonishing 63% of the American public remained captivated by the unfolding drama. Nearly 100 journalists stood vigil outside the politician's residence on the fateful morning of September 11, 2001, right before a global tragedy abruptly redirected the world's gaze. The mystery deepened on May 22, 2002, when a civilian walking his dog stumbled upon weathered human bones deep within the sprawling woods of Rock Creek Park. Discovered a mere 4 miles from her front door, the chilling find was soon positively identified as the missing intern through meticulous dental record comparisons. A catastrophic miscalculation by local law enforcement had allowed her body to lie abandoned and decaying in the wilderness for 12 agonizing months. Search teams had inexplicably confined their sweeps to a mere 100 yards from paved roadways, utterly neglecting the deeper hiking paths and bypassing her completely. While the chief medical examiner officially classified her tragic end as a brutal murder, the exact method of her demise remained an elusive, chilling mystery. Justice seemingly arrived in October 2010 when Ingmar Guandique, an undocumented immigrant from El Salvador with known gang ties, was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree felony charges. He was already behind bars for viciously assaulting 2 separate female victims at knife point in that exact same park during the precise timeline of her vanishing. Suspiciously, he had entirely inexplicably vanished from his workplace on May 1, 2001, the very day the young intern was erased from existence. The prosecution's victory hinged almost entirely on the damning words of Armando Morales, a prison cellmate who swore the accused had chillingly confessed to the killing behind bars. handed a staggering 60-year prison sentence in February 2011, the agonizing saga felt, at least momentarily, as though it had finally reached a definitive conclusion. Yet, like a house of cards, the entire judicial victory swiftly and spectacularly disintegrated. State attorneys discovered the star witness possessed a massive, hidden track record of trading information for leniency, entirely destroying his sworn testimony that he had never acted as a police informant. The narrative fractured further when an individual by the name of Babs Proler suddenly stepped out of the shadows with explosive information. She revealed that the key informant admitted to inventing the entire jailhouse confession simply to manipulate his way into a much safer protective custody unit. Facing a collapsed narrative on July 28, 2016, the government officially abandoned all charges, conceding their inability to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Stripped of his conviction, the accused man was quietly deported back to El Salvador on the 5th of May, 2017. The fallout ensnared lead prosecutor Amanda Haynes, who was subjected to severe disciplinary hearings for actively concealing critical evidence that could have exonerated the defendant. By August 2025, the District of Columbia Court of Appeals handed her a 60-day suspension, which was ultimately stayed in exchange for a full year of probationary oversight. Today, the chilling demise of the ambitious intern officially lingers in the cold case files, utterly lacking a definitive resolution. Trace male genetic material recovered from her abandoned items in the woods remains unidentified, pointing neither to the gang member, the congressman, nor any soul in criminal databases. Her grieving mother, Susan, continues a relentless crusade, demanding that modern, cutting-edge forensic technologies be deployed to re-examine the biological evidence. The disgraced politician was ousted in the 2002 primary elections, eventually retreating to Arizona and penning an autobiographical account in 2016. To this absolute day, he has maintained a stone-cold silence, refusing to ever publicly admit to the illicit romantic entanglement. The sprawling, shadowed woods where she took her final steps that fateful spring morning still stand silently, just 4 miles from her former doorstep. What unspeakable horror transpired on that secluded path, and whose microscopic identity remains hidden in the evidence? Her tragic fate once paralyzed the entire country. However, our subsequent descent into darkness shifts to a drastically different epoch, unearthing a blood-soaked lover's lane in 1960 Portland. For more than 60 agonizing years, the true identities of the monsters who destroyed Larry Payton and Beverly Allen have fueled relentless, heated debate. The nightmare commenced on the evening of November 27, 1960, precisely at 32 minutes past 9 o'clock. Law enforcement officers in Portland, Oregon, were dispatched into the pitch-black, isolating depths of a secluded dead-end street within Forest Park. Slumped inside a vintage 1949 Ford coupe was 19-year-old Larry Ralph Payton, mercilessly butchered with 23 knife wounds from a 4-inch blade, alongside a catastrophic skull fracture. A singular, sinister bullet hole pierced the vehicle's windshield, chillingly fired outward from the confines of the passenger cabin. A bloodied blade rested ominously upon the vehicle's hood, yet the most terrifying detail was the glaring absence of a second passenger. 19-year-old Beverly Ann Allen had vanished into the night, leaving behind her jacket, a purse holding $11, shattered eyeglasses, and a violently torn necklace. Adding a deeply sinister layer to the crime scene, investigators recovered segments of mysterious green nylon rope scattered nearby. Just 24 hours earlier, on the day following Thanksgiving, she had made the long drive from Port Townsend, Washington, specifically to spend time with him in Oregon. The young couple's romance had blossomed during seasonal employment at Crater Lake National Park earlier that year, blossoming into a dedicated long-distance courtship. Following a seemingly ordinary supper at his family residence, the pair departed near 9 o'clock in his classic coupe, unwittingly driving toward their doom. Their final known destination was a notorious romantic hideaway, hidden away at the desolate terminus of that dark, forested road. The 43-day manhunt ended grimly on January 9, 1961. Roadway crews unearthed Beverly's remains along the desolate Sunset Highway, exactly 30 miles west of Portland. The victim lay partially undressed. Her wrists were brutally secured with green nylon rope, chillingly identical to the bindings discovered at the primary crime scene. Following a savage assault, she was strangled to death. Hauntingly, her shattered wristwatch remained forever frozen at exactly 11:22. The ensuing massive dragnet interrogated 2,292 individuals and scrutinized 453 suspects, yet an agonizing 6 years passed before any formal indictments. In October of 1966, the cold case fractured open when desperate detectives received a highly cryptic letter from a mysterious woman named Nikki Essex. Claiming intimate knowledge of the bloodshed, she pointed a highly damning finger directly at two brothers, Edward Ralph Jorgensen and Carl Frederick Jorgensen. Implicated alongside a third accomplice, Robert Gordon Braum, the entire trio was finally taken into police custody during the sweltering August of 1968. Acting as the star witness, Essex testified that these aggressive men initially crossed paths with Peyton and Allen inside a bustling downtown diner. An alleged road rage altercation erupted, prompting the aggressive men to relentlessly hunt the terrified couple deep into the shadowed woods of Forest Park. Yet, a profoundly dark shadow hovered over this entire prosecution. Essex's testimony wasn't natural. Her so-called memories were extracted, utilizing hypnosis alongside sodium amytal, a highly controversial substance notoriously branded as truth serum. Modern psychology universally condemns these extreme interrogation tactics as deeply flawed, citing their terrifying capacity to easily implant entirely fabricated recollections into fragile minds. Despite shaky evidence, Edward Jorgensen caught a first-degree conviction for Beverly's demise and a second-degree for Larry's. Braum was slapped with a first-degree guilty verdict regarding Larry. Both men received life sentences plus an additional 25 years. Meanwhile, Carl Jorgensen managed to walk out of the courtroom completely exonerated. However, a sinister unease plagued the public consciousness from the very start, heavily compounded when both convicted murderers were granted shockingly premature prison releases. Edward tasted freedom merely 3 years later, and Braum at 7. Such inexplicably lenient timelines practically scream that the parole board privately questioned their absolute guilt. Lurking ominously over this entire narrative is Edward Wayne Edwards, a notoriously documented and incredibly lethal convicted serial predator. In his twilight years, he freely admitted to orchestrating a string of shockingly identical, cold-blooded ambushes on vulnerable couples parked in secluded Midwestern lovers' lanes. Chillingly, Edwards was actively prowling Portland during these specific slayings. Investigators even stumbled upon him directly at the crime scene 24 hours later, nursing a fresh gunshot wound. Roughly 7 days following that bizarre encounter, law enforcement finally detained him, though strictly for an entirely unassociated criminal offense. Yet he vanished like a ghost when an accomplice masquerading as a parole official orchestrated his illicit release, immediately catapulting him onto the FBI 10 Most Wanted list in 1961. Investigative reporter Phil Stanford resurrected these buried ghosts, meticulously assembling a compelling alternate narrative within his 2010 true crime manuscript, The Peyton Allen Files. He forcefully asserted that Edwards was the true monster, while Essex was simply a psychological puppet, heavily brainwashed by detectives until her drug-induced delusions perfectly mirrored their preferred narrative. Taking his darkest secrets to the grave, Edwards died in 2011, utterly refusing to officially confess to this specific double homicide. Technicians eventually tested his hair sample against biological evidence recovered from Allen's remains, though the microscopic results frustratingly yielded a negative match. Despite glaring inconsistencies and alternate theories, the formal judicial convictions against both Jorgensen and Braum remain legally locked in place today. Local law enforcement rigidly refuses to blow the dust off these files, purposefully omitting the tragedy from Multnomah County's official registry of active unsolved cold cases. Nevertheless, it retains a dark legacy, as arguably the most fiercely debated and heavily scrutinized criminal catastrophe in Portland history. A chorus of modern sleuths and investigative minds firmly believe innocent souls took the fall. Did Jorgensen and Braum actually pull the trigger that fatal night? Or did a bloodthirsty, prolific drifter simply stroll away from the carnage, nursing a wounded arm as he vanished forever into the misty Oregon darkness? The bloody legacy of the Peyton and Allen tragedy has sparked intense, bitter speculation for well over 6 agonizing decades. Yet, our final descent takes us back even further in time. It is perhaps the most profoundly unsettling mystery of all, an enigma completely devoid of forensic evidence, prime suspects, or corpses. All that remained was a solitary, ghost-like vessel, floating aimlessly through the treacherous, churning rapids of the sprawling Grand Canyon. Enter Glenn and Bessie Hyde. Around November 18, 1928, this adventurous newlywed couple was last spotted, rowing their wooden craft down the muddy waters. Eyewitnesses specifically placed the intrepid pair just downstream of the unforgiving violent currents known locally as Hermit Rapid. A local cameraman named Adolf Sutro likely holds the grim distinction of being the final soul to gaze upon them breathing. Their strict itinerary had them reaching Needles, California, by December 6th. That highly anticipated arrival simply never materialized. The dark, enduring saga of Glenn and Bessie Hyde had officially commenced. Their abrupt erasure from existence stands as a foundational, chilling riddle of the American West. 29-year-old Glenn Rollin Hyde entered the world on December 9, 1898, in Twin Falls, Idaho. An expert river runner and rugged farmer, he had already proven his mettle by successfully taming the ferocious currents of the Salmon and Snake Rivers. His bride, 22-year-old Bessie Louise Haley, was born far from those western waters on December 29, 1905, in Parkersburg, West Virginia. A passionate, creative soul, she was actively pursuing art at a prestigious San Francisco academy. Destiny forcefully intertwined their paths during a fateful passenger ship voyage in February of 1927. After Bessie finalized a divorce from her previous spouse, the deeply enamored pair officially tied the knot on April 12, 1928. Fueled by relentless ambition, Glenn meticulously constructed a massive 20-foot flat-bottomed wooden sweep scow in Green River, Utah, christening the homemade vessel Rain in the Face. Their overarching objective was completely unprecedented. The fearless duo fully intended to conquer the merciless rapids of the Green and Colorado Rivers straight to Needles. If successful, they would shatter speed records, immortalizing Bessie as the very first woman to ever navigate the entire Grand Canyon. Their fateful descent began on October 20th, 1928, stepping into churning waters utterly unprotected without a single life preserver. Around November 16th, the weary pair clawed their way up the punishing Bright Angel Trail, seeking desperately needed provisions at the canyon's south rim. During this brief respite, they crossed paths with local photographer Emery Kolb, who unknowingly captured the final, haunting image of the doomed duo. Kolb observed a profound, reluctant exhaustion in Bessie's demeanor. When he pleaded with her husband to accept flotation gear, Glenn merely chuckled at the grim warning. Even a generous offer of safe, warm shelter for the brutal winter months was stubbornly rejected by the unyielding river runner. Before walking away forever, Bessie gazed at a young girl's dress, uttering a chillingly prophetic whisper that still haunts the canyon. "I wonder if I will ever wear beautiful shoes again." Their failure to reach the Needles checkpoint triggered a frantic hunt led by Glenn's father. Finally, on December 19th, 1928, aviators spotted their wooden vessel floating aimlessly. Hovering near River Mile 237, the craft appeared eerily pristine, perfectly upright, and entirely undamaged by the violent rapids. The phantom ship still held all their rations, survival gear, and the young bride's journal, its chilling final passage penned on November 30th. Investigators discovered heavy coats, sturdy boots, a loaded weapon, and a camera, alongside a macabre tally, 42 distinct slashes etched into the timber, marking each surviving day. The final frame on that film exposed a location around mile 165. Yet, despite an exhausting, months-long drag of the water, the wilderness refused to yield their corpses. As years bled into decades, a tangled web of wild speculations, whispers, and dark suspicions began to fester. The mystery deepened in 1971 when an older tourist named Elizabeth Arnold Cutler joined a guided commercial expedition through the very same gorge. While listening to the tragic folklore beside the firelight, she suddenly confessed to being the missing bride, alleging she had killed an abusive Glenn in self-defense before escaping into obscurity. Yet, as quickly as the startling admission surfaced, she entirely retracted the explosive confession. Archival documents ultimately exposed her fabrication, proving she was birthed in Pomeroy, Ohio, during 1908, revealing her to be a complete stranger to the tragedy. The plot twisted again following the May 1992 death of renowned canyon guide Georgie White Clark, whose secret files contained a birth certificate bearing the name Bessie D. Ross. Alongside a hidden handgun lay a pristine copy of the doomed couple's marriage license, instantly igniting frantic rumors that this veteran outdoorswoman was the fugitive bride herself. Yet this tantalizing lead also crumbled under scrutiny. Extensive historical records confirmed the late guide was actually born in Oklahoma back in 1911. Investigators ultimately dismissed the hidden paperwork as nothing more than an elaborate dark joke meant to confuse researchers after her passing. Today, those who intimately understand the canyon's lethal currents overwhelmingly agree on a much colder, simpler reality: a tragic, accidental drowning. It is highly probable the massive, churning whitewater around mile 232 violently ejected the pair from their unprotected craft. Hidden beneath that specific stretch lies a jagged maze of ancient rock, a treacherous graveyard responsible for shattering countless vessels over the years. Plunged into freezing autumn depths without buoyancy, crushing rapids and immediate hypothermia would have sealed their fate instantly, dragging their lifeless forms away to be devoured by the abyss. Officially, authorities have long since abandoned the pursuit of answers, letting the dust settle on this decades-old enigma. In the year 2001, historian Brad Dimmock released the ultimate deep dive into the mystery, chillingly naming it "Sunk Without a Sound," a hauntingly prophetic line ripped straight from the missing woman's poetry. To truly grasp the psychological and physical terror the couple endured, Dimmock and his spouse constructed an exact duplicate of the doomed wooden boat, daring to navigate the identical, punishing route. Today, the surviving artifacts, including those chilling photographs and that final, quiet journal, rest securely within the guarded archives of Northern Arizona University. Even as 100 years approach, seasoned navigators still speak of the phantom couple in hushed tones, the dark lore echoing against the steep walls under starry night skies. It remains a chilling reminder of a doomed honeymoon, two lovers who etched 40, two desperate marks into timber before the earth simply swallowed them without a trace. That concludes our descent into the shadows for now. We appreciate your time in the abyss. Select the next case to keep uncovering the unknown.